Hey, so I'm with Yasha Levine from St. Petersburg, and we're going to talk a little bit about the cyber-attribution industry in a moment, but the news of the day sort of necessitates that we address what happened in St. Petersburg, which was that there was an attack on the subway, and you happen to live right nearby. Um, what is your sense of how people are reacting to it?
I mean, people are shocked, obviously, and people are shaken. People do talk about, it's the kind of stuff that you get, I think, anywhere. Is people talk about how they almost got on the train, or how they were just 5 minutes behind, or how they got on, if they weren't late, getting out of work or something, or going to work, they might have gotten stuff there. But people here, they're shaken and they're a bit angry, but it's muted. It's not like there isn't. Um, People, it takes a lot more to shake Russians. Than it takes a lot more than just killing 14 people. It's as horrible as it is. Russians are tougher. They have a kind of thicker skin, and they have a higher threshold for really the kind of outrages you'd see if this happened in the States or in Europe somewhere. I think the outrage and the fear mongering and the public reaction of just this sort of palpable fear would be much greater, right, in the West. Has been my experience. And so here you don't. I mean, I didn't even hear people talk about it today. I was sitting in a cafe for a couple hours, and I mean, no one talked about it. And in fact, when I first learned of it, I was sitting in that same cafe, and I was getting another cup of coffee, and I said, "Hey, did you hear about the news? There's been an explosion, like a terror attack in the subway." And the young woman who was selling me the coffee, she's like, "Yeah, I know. Everyone's writing about it on Facebook. No emotion."
Yeah.
And I mean, it was just around the corner from there. So, I mean, it's weird because the apartment that my wife and I are renting for a couple months here, it's on the Fontanka River, which is, it's it's the second major river that bisects St. Petersburg, and the subway line passes about maybe 500 yards to my left, so north of me. And so if I stand on the balcony that I have and I look north, I mean, I can see pretty much the exact spot where the explosion happened, which is the underground. And but like, I mean, I take both of those subway stations all the time, and so it's a bit weird. Yeah. And I do believe it's the first. I could be mistaken, but I do believe it's the first terrorist attack that struck the St. Petersburg metro system.
Yeah, I'm thinking back to the Boston bombing in 2013 and the incredible frenzy that caused. And that was literally some pressure cookers killing three people, injuring many more. Obviously, it was a bad incident. Nobody would want to downplay the severity of it for the people that were impacted, but it caused just a massive
Yeah.
nationwide frenzy for like
They
weeks.
logged down the city, and they
Yeah,
logged down the city. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, I remember
And
that.
so I
Well,
just,
look, I mean, it was a much more cinematic, right? Terrorist attack. I mean, the pictures that came out of that. I mean, it was in broad daylight. It was in the middle of a marathon, right? It was pretty brutal, and so here there are no photos. I mean, not really. It happened underground. No one really saw it. A very small number of people were in that. So yeah, but I totally agree. I mean, and that's what I'm trying to say is that Russians they take this stuff very very they respond to it in a different way. And it takes a lot more than a dozen people getting killed for there really to be a kind of a national freakout. I remember I was in Moscow. There was a terrorist attack in 2008, and again it was the same thing. There was a suicide bombing in one of the central, one of the busiest stations there, Park Kultura, which is Park of Culture. It's one of the busiest hubs in the center, and I mean, all that people I could remember were saying was that how it just because it snarled traffic completely and people couldn't get home, and it was a nightmare. And so that's what people were complaining about more than anything. It was like one of those things where I remember, in San Francisco, like if someone is trying to commit suicide by jumping off the San Francisco, the Golden Gate Bridge, I mean, people just pissed off, just like do it already, because I want to get home, that kind of thing. So yeah, it's muted, but people are scared, and I think it is a bit repressed. The fear here it isn't as quite as public, and there isn't a kind of a whole industry that thrives on whipping up people's emotions in this kind of way. Although it could very well do that, but it's interesting that the Russian media doesn't really, for all the demonization it gets, it doesn't really use the xenophobia as much as it could, and really turn up the kind of the hate and the racial hate, because of these things. And so, I mean, in the States, we'd be probably hearing about it'd be just like Trump would be rounding up. There'd be probably concentration camps, it's already being set up if something like this happened. But anyway, so it's freaky here, but it's muted.
There's a cottage industry now in the U.S. where everybody is a self-proclaimed Russia expert suddenly. Yeah. So immediately when the news of the attack broke, you had these kind of charlatan figures who have built up a big social media following of weaving together these fanciful conspiracy theories. They came out and kind of wondered whether this could be a false flag. So that is coming from the center left now more so than the right. Did you observe that? Did you just scoff at it?
I mean, there's some of that happening here in Russia. There's a kind of a liberal, wing of the sort of establishment here that's essentially backed Putin back in the day when he just took power, but they split and they're sort of out of power essentially. And there's a theory going around in those circles here that because there were these protests that happened just about a week and a half ago, pretty big protests in cities across Russia, mostly in Moscow and St. Petersburg, that had to do with corruption, and there was an investigation released showing how Dmitry Medvedev is using all these different foundations to sort of slosh money around and has all this property, and there were a lot of young people came out and protested corruption, and so people here are saying that this was kind of a false flag to basically dampen this revolution that was about to happen. Now, of course, there was no revolution. There was not going to be a revolution, but yeah, I mean, so it's not just America that has these things. But I mean, it's funny. Like I came here to Russia actually in October. Tried to get away from try to get away and get some peace and quiet because I'm trying to finish up my book, and I'm like in the last leg of it, and I'm editing it and I'm shaping it, and I just need to be away from the world, And it was a bad time to move here. Because my phone's blowing up, my emails are blowing up. I'm like, people are asking me to write articles. I just have to almost, reject all these things because I have to finish my book. Russia is the shit. It's hot. It is at the center of the world, and it's not clear why, to be honest, because it isn't really at the center of the world. That's a fantasy. That's definitely an establishment fantasy.
So did you observe firsthand any of those protests that happened a week and a half ago?
No, I didn't actually. I had to leave. I left that week because I needed to. My visa was expired and I need to renew it.
Oh, okay. Because I was curious to know a little bit more about the demographics of those things, and you saw a lot of sort of establishment liberals in the U.S. really promote those protests heavily because it advanced their preferred narrative. I'm sure there was some sort of organic value to it, but I didn't know how quite to process it.
I mean, look, I have friends that went there, and they are real and they're organic. Were sort of triggered by this guy named Alexei Navalny. Right, he's a sort of opposition figure who's been in jail. He's really taking on Putin, and he's really popular among the sort of the younger urban sort of intellectual class, urban, I wouldn't call it elites, but yeah, I'd say younger, more educated urban class of Russians, mostly in Moscow, but in St. Petersburg as well, and pockets all over the country. And and he's been running kind of this anti-corruption organization that's puts together these cool little things, where they really dig into ownership information and try to find like people's assets that government officials are hiding, and how they're milking the system, and how they're leeching off the system, right? And so he does a really good job. I mean, I don't agree with his politics, and I think that he's kind of a dangerous figure because he's really not that much different than Vladimir Putin or Yeltsin. Even he's just kind of a younger, nationalistic kind of liberal. His vision is really, I don't see it differing very much from theirs. It's just that he hasn't been really tainted by being in power. He's never been in power, and so he's very nationalistic. Actually, he's very anti-Muslim. He's very anti-immigrant. In fact, he's been campaigning to restrict immigration of people from Central Asia. The suspected suicide bomber that blew himself up the other day here in St. Petersburg, he's from Central Asia. And so there is a kind of he represents a sort of xenophobic, nationalistic, liberal wing, but that's younger and kind of just pissed off and disgusted with the nepotism and this just crony, kind of like old Soviet kind of elite that's in power now, and so those protests, I mean, they were organic and they were real, and the people who came out, they believed it, and it wasn't like some kind of, it wasn't a fake protest movement. It wasn't a fake day of action, but it was kind of, it was motivated. It's organic, and it was opposed to Putin and opposed to his clan for sure. But the problem with it is that it doesn't really have an alternative vision for the country. I mean, you can be against corruption and you can be against sort of nepotism, right? But that's not an ideology. I mean, you can have everyone's against corruption. I mean, it's like everyone's for freedom. Everyone wants to have a kind of an honest system. But like that is not an ideology in and of itself. And that's not a path forward. It's a good way of sort of demonizing someone, but then there isn't really anything to back it up because the system that those people envision it to the extent that the people who were at this protest, because I know a lot of my friends support Navalny and showed up there and protested here in St. Petersburg, to the extent that they even have an idea. The idea doesn't really differ that much from what goes on in Russia. It's just saying like, we need to replace, judges with less corrupt judges. Okay, how do we do that? We need to replace, these politicians like with less corrupt politicians. Well, okay, they might be less corrupt now, but once they're in power, how do you prevent them from being corrupt? So there isn't like anything there, but they're real and they were spontaneous and I think they surprised everybody and people were kind of freaked out. But I'd like to say that when I came back to the country, it sucks, like I'm here and the day that I leave essentially is when the protests happened. And when I came back, I was talking to some friends who took part in this, and they said they were laughing, the fact that Russia's a police state, but police didn't do anything for like hours. They were basically like walking around the city center, protesters, and only after they like completely walked through the main street here, Nevsky Prospect, clear across downtown, then people started getting arrested, and most of the people had already left because they got bored. So there was like this kind of an unsanctioned rally, thousands of people, and they basically milled around, the whole day around downtown, and no one got arrested the whole day until the very, very end. And so it was kind of, people were laughing at that.
Yeah, there were people here who were demanding that, the Trump administration or the State Department more forcefully condemn the arrests of protesters in Russia, as that in itself was supposed to be taken as evidence of being a police state. And I mean, have they ever covered domestic protest movements in the United States? There were plenty of protesters arrested under the Obama regime, but nobody seemed to mind that much. Well, I spent 2 nights in jail.
I briefly covered the Occupy LA.
I remember your.
I spent 2 nights in jail, man, and I got scabies, and I was. It was pretty brutal. We were all handcuffed. I mean, I've never experienced. I haven't seen treatment like this in Russia. I covered protests here in Russia when I worked out here, and I even got detained during a protest in 2008 against the presidential elections, and there, explicitly, journalists were let out. So everyone got kind of thrown into these kind of vans. And, just people who were out on the street got kind of grabbed and thrown like would have happened in America. But then, at least here the cops like they have the kind of wherewithal to go around and knock on the doors. Say, hey, are there any journalists here? And then you let the journalists out, and at least take the people to the police station. But in LA, I was like, hey, I'm a journalist. Can I leave this? You're kettling me. Like I don't want to be arrested. Can I leave? They're like no. And the one journalist who tried to actually break through, and he had an LA. He was credentialed with the LAPD. He was showing him his journalist press pass. I am accredited with you guys. Can you let me through? And he tried to kind of muscle his way through the line. I mean, they beat him. Yeah, this is in LA. And the rest of us, I spent 2 nights in jail, and I got scabies in jail. And then I gave scabies to my wife. It was pretty horrific. I don't know if you know anyone who's ever gotten scabies, but it's a pretty brutal.
Yeah, and I remember reading that. I remember reading your account of that at the time. I didn't suffer anything nearly as horrendous during Occupy, but I was in New York at the time, and I got literally slugged by high-ranking police officers just as a matter of course. I mean, nobody really paid much mind to it. Like literally, a high-ranking police officer just punched me in the shoulder, just for walking down a street. It was incredible. And, people, they were threatened to take my notepad and recording device. And all the kind of just stuff that you would, if it had gone on in Russia, these establishment liberals and I guess even some conservatives will be rushing to declare that evidence of, a police state.
Yeah, totally. No, I mean, there's clearly a double standard here. And, granted, the people's experience with police here in Russia can vary widely. And sometimes it's fairly, decent. You're treated decently, and other times you can be brutalized in a really bad way. So it can be really bad here. But from having reported here and in the States and have been arrested and detained by police, I mean, from my own personal experience, I've been treated much worse in the United States, much worse. And in fact, I went through the whole court system, and I lost. I was found guilty in the end, actually, of my charge was loitering in a park. Essentially, they charged me with homeless. It was vagrancy,
Yeah. And they have all sorts of just absurd charges that they can pull out of thin air, like, obstructing pedestrian traffic, or what was the most ridiculous one in New York? It was like obstructing governmental action, I think. I mean, that could literally apply to almost anything. It was sort of like a Kafka-esque kind of legal regime that they had going there just to thwart these public demonstrations.
Yeah, I mean, well, I think the law is that, you can usually throw someone in jail for pretty much, you can accuse them with pretty much of anything, right? And then
and even if the charge is thrown out later, they don't care because the immediate aim was simply just to get you off the street.
Exactly, to stop the protest and to it was interesting, and the way that it was choreographed with the newspapers there too in LA, it was really gross to watch because they created essentially a kind of it was like they imported a kind of war zone strategy where you have embedded journalists. So there are only a handful of people, journalists, who are allowed to be embedded with the police. So essentially, be there when the cops are arresting people, and then everyone else was supposed to go to a press corner that was like around the corner from that where actually things were happening. And then they worked out an agreement where photographs taken by the journalists who were accredited, and these are of course just the major news networks and LA Times. Then they would be able to, they'd have to share that with the press pool. And then, the press pool can then use those pictures and sort of report on what's happening. And so that's why I was there. I was like, fuck this. I'm not going to, this is insane. I mean, this is like, it's illegal, actually. You can't restrict me from going there. It's a public park, and so that's why I was arrested, because they didn't want they wanted to restrict the coverage, and they wanted to control the coverage, and they wanted to have a positive spin on the coverage. So they wanted to prevent anyone who might not toe the line, the LAPD line and sort of the city of LA line. They wanted them off to the side, and only people who they could count on to soften the coverage. And that's exactly what happened. When I was in jail and we were all basically handcuffed and thrown into a giant parking lot inside the city jail because there was not enough space to put everyone there. We were just sort of like dumped in a parking lot inside the jail that has these like really thick iron doors for these transport buses to come in, and that's where they unload the prisoners. So we were just actually sleeping there the first night people just spent on the floor handcuffed, on the concrete floor. While that was happening, and there were articles, in LA Times and CNN that was reporting on it and commending the LAPD for their professional handling of the protesters. Meanwhile, there's like people bleeding next to me in shock. There's like a guy with a broken arm.
And there was this fetishization during that period of credentialism, meaning if you had gotten a press pass that was issued by the police department, that made you an official journalist who got special rights and special access to cover stuff. And now that didn't always save you, but there were definitely credential reporters who also got rounded up. But this idea that you have to get the police's department's approval and go through this formal process to be considered like a real journalist, that was really noxious, and that's something that really was popularized during that period.
No, exactly. I mean, there was a kind of they were importing essentially an embedded journalist model for covering police action, right? And covering protests as if it's a war zone, right? So you can't hang out with the protesters because that's the enemy, like. You got to stay with us, and if you want to stay with us and you want to get access to the war zone, well, you got to be a credential. Then you can kind of ride with the troops and ride shotgun, and you can get all the good footage. Yeah, it's insane. And so and if you get caught with the insurgency, then you're the enemy. If you're just kind of hanging out there, yeah. And you might get taken out by an Apache helicopter or just a billy club. It's like.
So in the course of your discussions with your friends and people you encounter in St. Petersburg, what is the take on the current obsession with Russia in the United States? Are people generally aware of it? I mean, to the extent that they're aware of it, how do they interpret it? Because I can only imagine that they are befuddled and weirded out by it.
I don't think people really can't handle it. I mean, I don't think people can process it, to be honest. Like, it's not something that makes any sense to them. I mean, it really, and I think it
doesn't make much sense to us, so nobody knows what to say.
Exactly. It's so absurd to them that they've essentially, I think, at least the people that I know, have shut it out. It's like, it's sort of a, first of all, you have to follow Western news, right? So there's a language barrier and a cultural barrier. So, to us, it all makes sense, right? Because we know all the players, it's the media landscape is in one in which we live, right? But to someone who's not from America, right, and maybe can read English or understand English, but isn't always reading the news and isn't immersed in that kind of environment, it doesn't necessarily filter through all the time, right? Because it's just they read different things. But the people that do follow American news and Western news, I mean, I think that they've kind of like it's something that they blank out. I mean, look, it's true. I mean, I can't even understand it. And I mean, I write about it, and I, and the only way that you can really understand it is to, you can either go along with it, to believe it, right, or you can sort of, you can only understand it as like as a defensive mechanism that's turned on in the American establishment to prevent dealing with their total, like collapse of their political credibility and their political capital. And they're just the rejection that they couldn't even win against a fucking buffoon like Trump, but even that doesn't fully make sense. And then, I mean, it really is a multi-layered phenomenon, with lots of levels to it. It's like the Cold War. It's like this. My book, I'm writing about a book. It's called Surveillance Valley, and it looks at the origins of the internet to try to explain why the internet is so messed up today, why it turned into this giant surveillance machine. And sort of I looked at the origins of the internet, and the more I kind of study the internet, the more I realize that America, in all its modern institutions, everything that has power today was really created during the Cold War. The kind of the think tank complexes, the military industrial complex, all the power structures really of the modern America go back to the Cold War, and that really is kind of the only mode in which things make sense in America. That's what they're geared. That's what this country's geared to fight. That's the conflict that modern America was built on. And I think it's just sort of when everything else has failed in America, and like all ideologies have failed, and everything kind of to shore up credibility and to have some kind of vision for the future or for the world, like, in a kind of primordial way, it reverts back to its sort of base and to a place where it's comfortable and where things make sense. And part of that, I think is what's going on now, with like the total obsession with Russia and a complete freak out with Russia. Because we can get to this a little later, but a lot of the cyber stuff, when they chase the evidence, it's no longer just about Russia anymore. It really is about drawing a line from the presidential campaign in 2016, right, and the supposed hacking that happened and the Russian meddling, to the Soviet Union and to the KGB and sort of the history of KGB operations and KGB intelligence operations and so they're now trying to put it together to create a continuum, and so you really see almost a kind of a crazy revisionism of reality, because there is no Soviet Unionism. I mean, there's some continuity there, obviously, but there's explicitly trying to make the case that the Putin of today and the sort of the Russia of today is really nothing more than Soviet Union sort of rebranded, and so you can actually make these cases. You can actually draw a clear line. So it's really reverting back. It's like a regression, and it's a very comfortable regression. It's clear, everything kind of works really well, right? When everyone's freaking out about Russia and getting to this Cold War mentality, somehow, like it just makes sense. I mean, it's horrific to watch, but there's a kind of a well-oiled feel to it, right? It's like a finely tuned machine that's really running really well.
Yeah. What's bizarre about it now, though, is that part of the impetus for fostering this new climate, or for reinvigorating it, is opposition to the incumbent president rather than the incumbent president himself doing it, which is what had been the case in the past. So It's sort of this weird inversion of prior cycles of hysteria that had kind of overtaken the political establishment, and it's hard to kind of sort out all the moving parts. On the one hand, I think there's definitely something to this idea that, in this void where the prevailing kind of orthodoxies of the time have decayed and failed, people kind of revert back to old habits to exalt this kind of enemy that they can position themselves in opposition to. But on the other hand, you have people who are immersed in just the day-to-day politics of it, who genuinely do think that this is their key to undermining Trump or weakening him or stymieing his political agenda. And for all I know, there might be some truth to that, because Trump's approval ratings are in the gutter already, and I think creating this atmosphere of scandal, whatever the merits, probably does ultimately have an adverse effect on Trump. So maybe they'll end up getting away with it.
No, it's true. I mean, it is diverting and distracting and kind of paralyzing his administration, because they have to deal with not only their own kind of like inept, sort of nature, but also they always have to be defending their flank and always on and yeah, I agree. It's paralyzing him and impeding his ability to rule, right? But I think also it is the incumbent not the incumbent that's doing it. It's sort of the establishment that's sort of lost out in this election. But I think that if you remember back to the campaign, and when Hillary was running against Donald Trump, and she was really sure that she was going to win. She was already beginning to run on, her campaign was largely based on like Russia, and essentially showing that Trump was a kind of if not a Manchurian sort of candidate and a kind of a Putin plant, then at least someone that's so dumb and weak and kind of and inexperienced, right, that he would just be completely manipulated by Putin. And so part of that involved, really elevating Russia to a really an existential threat, to America, and essentially running a campaign that was
It wasn't even against Trump. It was against Putin, and that's the sense that I got. So already it was being set up, back then. And if she had won, if Hillary Clinton had won, I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if we would see something even crazier than what we're seeing today, because it would be, again, the only thing that makes sense to her and to this failed political establishment is sort of to revert back to this Cold War mentality, where things are very sure there, and like you don't have to, and you also don't have to address the political problems that are plaguing America. And so I agree. It's fucking weird that it's actually the opposition that's basically pushing for nuclear war, with Russia essentially, and and the crazy belligerent president, is like, who's a fascist, like, whoa, 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 whoa. Maybe we shouldn't go to nuclear war. Maybe we should go, have a war with Iran instead. I agree, but I think it would have been interesting to see a parallel universe in which Hillary won, and how Russia would have been treated in it, because I think everything was being set up, from what I could see, to push hardcore against Russia, and because it was like, again, the new evil, right? It was essentially undermining world peace, from Ukraine to Syria, right, to Iran. Like, Russia was the thing that was sort of, if you remove Russia finally, then there could be global peace and prosperity for all. And so I think that's the direction where it was going, and you kind of just essentially pivot that campaign, and just include Trump in it. And I think that's what we're seeing the results of.
Yeah, a lot of people in the sort of, media intelligentsia now are coming to recognize that this Russia conspiracy frenzy has resulted in paranoia being stoked in much of the populace. So they're trying to push back on the most egregious excesses of it. But as you mentioned, this really began something like 9 months ago now, when the Clinton campaign made this a central theme of the 2016 campaign. So, of course, that is going to become ingrained within segments of the Democratic Party who are still aggrieved now as to why their candidate lost. So the time to push back on those excesses would have been 9 months ago, rather than now, when it's already been central in the consciousness of so many people for such a long time, and they're now so committed to finally unearthing this smoking gun revelation, which never seems to come, but which they think is finally going to, topple Trump.
Yeah, I mean, I don't even know what to say to that. Yeah, I mean, I think I don't know. The Democrats are clearly setting themselves up for another spectacular loss. I mean, maybe it's a good thing. I mean, it probably is a good thing. I mean, I don't know. I mean, it's definitely going to get worse, whatever happens. Yeah, I mean, look, it's interesting, right? Because it's also what's there's an interesting component here, right? Which is the internet has entered this election, right? Like never before, really. And I mean, I guess Obama was really the first president to really, that was the Facebook election of 2008, where he leveraged Facebook, and sort of it became a big component of electoral politics and political technology. But like, the internet is interesting now, right? Because before, the internet was seen as a tool of freedom and liberation, and it was like it allowed candidates to directly interact with their potential voters and to deliver the message. Now with Trump, the internet has taken this sort of dark side, and now all of a sudden the internet is an evil force, And I've been interested in to see how that has switched. Because of Trump, now people are much more skeptical of the internet in general. And what was this, the peak of a kind of a liberal idea of the marketplace of ideas. And so in the end, it doesn't matter who's funding what, right? It doesn't matter which think tanks are pushing what. It doesn't matter that if it's where this information is coming from. Information itself, good information, true information, correct information, will sort of win out, right, in the marketplace of ideas, because of course we're all just rational and we're sort of choosing the best kind of information. And so, but now when that marketplace, right, is sort of being perceived to be used to tank Hillary and to take out the Democratic Party, the marketplace is evil, and the marketplace needs to be stopped. And we need to actually, now there's hearings, in Congress talking about the need to to fund, to expand American propaganda, government propaganda operations, to combat the sort of marketplace of ideas. So it's been interesting to see, it's like all the liberal ideas about the world and everything that's sort of held dear to American liberals has been kind of turned upside down because of this.
Yeah, in the hearing last week in the Senate, that theme was definitely seized upon, and it wasn't just because Trump was able to marshal the darker corners of the internet to take down Hillary. It was because he did so with the aid of Russians, supposedly.
Yeah.
So Kamala Harris, who's the new senator from California, did something which, a couple of years ago, I think probably would have been perceived as just unbelievably absurd. She basically first of all, she invoked Dick Cheney and basically affirmed his framing of the current quote-unquote conflict as supposed to indicate an act of war, that Russia has committed an act of war on the U.S. And she said that the combatants in that war are cyber soldiers. She used the term cyber soldiers, and by that she literally meant trolls on Twitter.
Yeah.
Okay? So that's how unbelievably, deranged the rhetoric has gotten. And like the absurdity is so in your face that people are struggling to even recognize it anymore.
No, yeah, it's become normalized, right? Or hyper normalized now. I mean, it's yeah, I agree. Yeah, I mean, if America can be taken down by a couple of people on Twitter, I mean, America maybe doesn't deserve to stand, really. I mean, because Twitter is one of the worst things that has happened to humanity, and it's one of the most vapid platforms there is. And so if a couple of people on it can take down a storied democracy, such like America, it's maybe it's not really worth saving, right? I mean, it really is. It's amazing how much they undermine their own I don't know, their own kind of beliefs, and how can America be grand if it can be taken down so easily?
Yeah, I mean, American exceptionalism kind of ceases to be an arguable notion if it can be undermined by a pretty trivial, quote unquote, interference effort by, a couple trolls somewhere.
And and of course this stuff is very it doesn't recognize America's weaponization of the internet, right? And doesn't recognize America's use of the internet and internet technologies and social media deploying those technologies to destabilize countries and to meddle in elections, and especially against Russia, and so yeah, I mean, it's I don't know. There's a lot of ways you can approach this stuff, and so when I'm out here in Russia and I'm trying to get away from it all, and and I'm trying, and to be honest, like I was thinking when I first heard about the hacking allegations, and and I said, okay, well, this could be true. This could be true. I mean, I don't. This is something that Russia could do. It has the power to do. It definitely has the power, and Hillary's so hated in Russia that I could see it be done as a kind of a troll almost, maybe not even, the point of electing Trump and knowing exactly what to do, but like to really mess with the process and to really kind of do a little payback to Hillary Clinton and Bill Clinton. And so I was willing to believe. I wanted the evidence, right? I was waiting for the evidence to come out, and the more I waited, months passed, and there were reports issued by private cybersecurity firms that were involved in investigating the DNC hacks and the hacks of John Podesta, CrowdStrike, and then there was sort of the Office of Director of National Intelligence issued a report along with the Department of Homeland Security. James Clapper testified, and they introduced all this evidence. But when you looked at it actually, and you looked into the details, you realized that there was nothing there. And everything was sort of built on a kind of almost like a kind of a, it was an investigation in reverse, right? So they wanted to prove that it was Russian. So they threw in a bunch of like technical information that, might point to Russia, but actually could easily point to, someone who was trying to make it look like it was Russia. Because, I mean, they were basically using the Russian characters in some of these little malware programs. They were compiling these programs like during, working hours in Moscow's time zone, things like that. They were putting in the names of of the founder of the Cheka, the first secret police, the Soviet secret police. They put that as like the sort of they remember Guccifer 2.0. He registered his Word program. He edited some of the Word files that he leaked with some of the emails that he got from that were obtained from Hillary Clinton's email. No, the hacked DNC emails, right? And so he was editing some of them. I don't know why he was editing them, but like there was and you could see like who edited this document, and there was like, oh, it's a registered Microsoft Word user, and his name is Felix Dzerzhinsky, which is sort of the name of the founder of the Cheka. And it's like, wait a minute, so like on this, you're actually going to take this at face value, and you're going to say that because this guy is like, the founder of the first Soviet secret police, it's clearly the Russians. I mean, that's the level of evidence, right, that I was seeing. And so I was sitting here and I was like trying hard not to pay attention to this because I'm trying to finish my book. But I was forced essentially to go back and to go back to my experience when I lived and worked in Russia a decade ago, when I reported on the first, was essentially the first kind of cyber war between between Russia and another country. But it was really kind of what I was witnessing then, and I didn't really realize it, was the birth of what we now know as like the cyber-attribution industry, or the cybersecurity industry, the private cybersecurity industry. And so there was, in 2008, there was a war between Georgia and a breakaway region called South Ossetia. That's sort of essentially a de facto part of Russia now. And and cyber war was a huge component in that war. Some cyber attacks against a couple of government websites, Georgian government websites, was taken as proof that Russia had like planned the invasion, weeks in advance. And so I remember reporting on that, and I was actually was writing an assignment for Wired magazine. And I also at the time, took it at face value and said, yeah, I mean, if these cyber experts are saying that there's evidence that there's a cyber war and that Russia was behind it, well, I'm sure there's some evidence. It's got to be true to some degree, because why would they just make stuff up? And so when I went down there thinking that, I was going to report on a cyber war and a cyber attack by Russia against Georgia, when I got to Georgia, when I was here in Moscow and St. Petersburg and talking to hackers in the industry and talking to my contacts in the security world, like I realized that the whole thing was essentially a myth. Like the evidence that was being marshaled to prove Russia's culpability was so thin that it was laughable, and people who were in the industry and people who were hackers themselves laughed at it. It was easily easy to fake, and in reality, it wasn't even really that tough, because all you do is just some kids broke into a Georgian website and hacked it and put put Hitler there, and so that was supposed to be Russia, that was supposed to be the KGB or the FSB, and so I kind of went back, and I think this is why you're interested in talking to me, right? Is because I went back and I kind of I dug out all that stuff, because I never actually wrote about my experience reporting on that, because I could never really put it into context, and it never really made sense to me. And that story actually ended up never being published, even though I tried to write it, because it was just too early, and it was just the beginning of it all. But now, and I was sitting here and looking at the evidence that was being marshaled to prove Russia's complicity in the hacks against America, I kept seeing not only the same kind of tactics that I saw being used in 2008 to prove Russian complicity, but I even saw the same people, and I just kind of had to write about it, because like they were so close and they were so similar, and the claims that were made against Russia back then, that Russia attacked Georgia and that it actually invaded Georgia, had been disproven by, among others, the EU, an investigation by the EU. And so all the stuff that was being marshaled to prove that Russia was an aggressor, and the cyber evidence that was being marshaled to prove that Russia had sort of planned the invasion. I mean, there was no actual invasion. And so the cyber evidence that was used to prove the invasion sort of dissipated, and people forgot about it, because there was no actual invasion. And so I went back and kind of compared what I'm seeing today and what we're seeing today to what I saw back then, when I was just sort of watching the birth of the cyber attribution industry. And it really is an industry a professional conspiracy theory industry, really, is what it is. I mean, it's a cyber conspiracy theory business. It's not really forensics.
Yeah, and you discuss all this in your article in the Baffler, which was really good, and we'll link to here. But one thing that struck me in watching these kind of absurd Senate hearings last week was that a representative from this firm FireEye was testifying. So everybody knows CrowdStrike, and that seems to be the genesis of much of the claims about Russia supposedly hacking the DNC. But FireEye was also employed to verify these claims, and it was left to a Republican senator from Oklahoma to actually kind of press this guy effectively on the nature of his investigative tactics. Because Democrats weren't interested in that, of course. So this Republican senator actually did a decent job, and he asked basically the FireEye representative to outline how he came to the conclusion that Russia was responsible for these hacks, and he admitted that his conclusion was based on, quote, deduction and process of elimination. So that's about as far from dispositive as you can get, and yet these findings are taken as gospel by kind of credulous people in the media who don't seem compelled to apply even a hint of skepticism to what these firms are saying.
Yeah, I mean, Mandiant is actually FireEye, because FireEye bought this. So the guy that testified that you're talking about is a guy named Kevin Mandiant.
Right.
He's a former U.S. Navy intelligence officer that has been sort of has been a sort of a cyber investigator. I don't know, for a couple of decades before he left government sector and sort of, I mean, before he left the government and started his own cybersecurity firm. The cybersecurity firm was then bought by a larger cybersecurity firm called FireEye, and now sort of he's an employee of FireEye, and it's called the division is actually even named after him. It's called Mandiant. But he's an interesting guy, right? And actually a lot of the intelligence that CrowdStrike, a lot of the evidence that CrowdStrike uses to prove. Do you hear that or no?
Yeah. I think is it coming from you?
Yeah, it's coming from me.
Yeah.
So hold on a second. 1 second. I see. I'm getting a call. I'm not sure if you were able to hear that.
Yeah, I heard a ring. It's no big deal though. It's fine.
Okay, no, because I wasn't sure. It was like because I saw you react. Anyway, the point is,
I was making sure that it wasn't me, but I was pretty sure.
Give me a second. Give me a second. Let me just type this. Hold on a second.
Okay.
1 second. I'm sorry. You're gonna have to cut that out, or maybe not. You can keep it in if you like.
Yeah, I don't think people care that much.
Yeah, just.
Anyway, we're rough and raw out here.
Yeah, exactly. Well, he's Jesus Christ. He's I don't mean to take to use the Lord's name in vain there. But anyway, he's an interesting guy, and it's an interesting firm. And so actually, he's not even most of the information that CrowdStrike uses to pin the hacks on Russia against the DNC and John Podesta actually most of them originate from Mandiant or Mandiant/FireEye, and they are the ones who actually, because it's there's Fancy Bear and Cozy Bear that those are the two kind of hacking groups that are thrown around.
Just to clarify real quick, the analysis that CrowdStrike says that it did was presented. I mean, it seems like it was presented as FireEye conducted its own independent analysis that corroborated CrowdStrike's findings. Were they separate analyses, or were they one and the same?
Well, I mean, here's the thing. It's they're separate, but there's a core of the information that's the same. Because you have to understand. Maybe we can backtrack and see how they do this kind of investigation. So there's these things called APTs, or active persistent threats, is what the industry calls them. So these are like groups of and methods that are a collection of like malware programs and ways in ways that hackers get into systems, right? And the kind of tools that they use to get into them, and the kind of methodology that they use, right? They sort of because there isn't like a group saying, hey, I'm this hacker group and I'm going to break into the DNC or I'm going to break into this bank, right? They just sort of, a forensic investigator goes into a computer system, right, that's been compromised, and they look into it and they see, okay, and they look at how they got in, and they look at how these people, how these hackers were sort of exfiltrating information, right? How they were hiding their tracks, what systems did they infect, and so they kind of get the tools, right, of how they got in there and what they're after. And then as they sort of observe this in a lot of different clients like banks, like think tanks, governments, they kind of start to assemble a picture. They're saying, okay, these tools, this collection of tools, we think roughly corresponds to a single group. All right, we don't know that for sure, but we're going to group them because we think that they belong to the same group, right? And so then they start like naming them, right? So they're like, okay, we give this persistent threat group, code APT28 or APT29, or APT27. That's like the sort of the generic thing, right? And so Mandiant / FireEye, they're the ones who really did the most work on attributing and sort of defining the modus operandi of APT28 and APT29, groups that CrowdStrike would rename Cozy Bear and Fancy Bear. And so Mandiant / FireEye did a lot of work, and their reports are kind of the only real public information that we have about the nature of these groups. So FireEye / Mandiant, they published a couple of reports talking about these threat groups and linking them to the Russian government. They were the ones who first linked them to the Russian government. A couple of years ago, so long before the election, and long before the accusations of the DNC that the Russians hacked the DNC. And so what CrowdStrike did is that they went into the DNC servers, right, and they looked at it, and they said, oh, this is APT28, and this is APT29, right? So they said, okay, they kind of identified the same threat actor group in the DNC servers. And then they just gave it a flashier name, and a name that directly linked it to Russia, which is, Fancy Bear and Cozy Bear, right?
And then the media just kind of mindlessly adopted that terminology as if it had some kind of official designation rather than just sort of something that was invented by these firms.
Yeah, totally. And what's interesting is that because I think the Russians actually did hack, there was a hack pretty sure carried out by the Russians. It was against the World Anti-Doping Agency, WADA, right? Showing that American Olympic competitors were using basically, Adderall and we were getting exemptions from their doctors to use banned substances, basically speed during competition, and so there was, if you remember, there was that hack, and there was a couple of stories written about it, but it kind of didn't really get that much attention because it was really kind of at the time when people were freaking out about Russia hacking America, and so this is a minor footnote, and so this is clearly the Russians, because the Russians were basically banned from competing in the in the Olympics. It was really even the Paralympics, the Russian team was banned completely. And so there was a kind of this hack, and the people who hacked WADA and released these documents showing that American athletes were taking speed and were sort of given exemptions to it by their doctors because they have medical conditions, ADHD and ADD, like every other journalist and college student in America. They were actually named them. So they made a website and they called them Fancy Bears, themselves Fancy Bears. So they were actually riffing. So these hackers were actually riffing on the name that was given to them, actually then calling themselves Fancy Bear. So they actually no one called themselves Fancy Bear before that. But only after CrowdStrike started calling them Fancy Bear and Cozy Bear, like these whoever hacked this Olympic agency WADA, they actually started calling themselves Fancy Bear, and then that was only further proof for the people who were trying to look for Russian connections everywhere that actually it is Fancy Bear and Cozy Bear, that they actually do exist. You understand? So it's pretty funny. Like it didn't exist until CrowdStrike named them these names. Yeah, they didn't exist. They've been known by a lot of different things. It depends on the cybersecurity company. Some cybersecurity companies call them Cozy Duke, Crazy Duke, or there's like these weird names that they give them. But it is Mandiant and FireEye that was the first one to really define this as a what they say is a unique group, APT 29/Fancy Bear, and attribute them to two different sort of wings of Russian intelligence services. One is the FSB, and the other one is the sort of military intelligence / GRU. And so CrowdStrike went into the servers and performed their own investigation, but I think that they used a lot of FireEye's information to actually attribute the attacks to Russia. Yeah.
Okay.
Say it shortly.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then, so then in your backflip piece, you had a good line where you say, quote, cyber attack attribution can be exploited to support any politicized version of events that one chooses. Yeah. And, it's really been a failing of the media in the United States that there has been such little skepticism applied to the claims of these firms, which were obviously retained to advance a particular narrative that was favorable to what the DNC had wanted to put out there in the public. I mean, I don't think anybody ever 100% discounted the idea that some Russian state actor could have been involved in these hacks, but it should have been conveyed to the public that these cyber attribution kind of endeavors aren't foolproof, and they can be manipulated to further whatever the people who are paying for that service want to advance.
Well, exactly. Look, there's an interesting thing here, right? Which is, so these cybersecurity firms are essentially privatized arms of the American intelligence, agencies, and they really are big. They're founded by people who have come from intelligence agencies, and they're staffed with people who come from there, and it's a sort of the privatization of America's kind of war machine. But what these firms do, they're interesting, is that they're kind of like lawyers in a sense, right? Because here's what happened. So when the DNC was hacked, right, the DNC did not call the FBI, and it called CrowdStrike to conduct the investigation, right? And CrowdStrike conducted the investigation, and then turned over the evidence that it got from the DNC, and turned over. I'm not even sure if it turned over the evidence, but it turned over the conclusions. I know that the FBI tried to request access to DNC servers, but the DNC denied them that. Now, I mean, when I read about that and when I learned about that, I recalled what happened with the Sony hack. Because if you remember, Sony was hacked and everybody blamed North Korea for it, all right? And it was supposed to be because of the film made by Seth Rogen, right? That really sort of pissed North Koreans off. But what was interesting is that FireEye played a big role in kind of doing damage control for Sony back then, because Sony, as soon as they got hacked, they called in FireEye, and FireEye came, and they worked with the FBI. But the role that FireEye played at the time was essentially a kind of a celebrity attorney, essentially, for Sony. So their role was, clearly Sony had been for years had been criticized for its really bad security practices, and whatever happened in Sony, there was it was really easy to hack the company, and security researchers have always been kind of critical of it. But what FireEye came in, and almost like a few days after the announcement of this hack, and the announcement that all the information, right, that Sony had on its corporate networks were leaked. It was kind of incredible. All its movies, right, that were in the works that hadn't even been released yet in the theaters. All the emails. Everything that company had was just dumped on the internet, right?
Emails of Sony executives complaining about celebrities being prima donnas and stuff.
Yeah, no, exactly.
There was fodder for gossip. Media people.
Gawker went totally insane, totally nuts with that information, and they were looking at I don't know what they were dissecting the Amazon purchases of the Sony CEO, and that she was buying some kind of pubic hair dyes essentially. Anyway, the point is that it was an embarrassing leak, and there was also a lot of personal information leaked. So a lot of employee information, their social security information. So essentially Sony was liable, legally liable potentially for not properly securing this information and not properly safeguarding this. And so if anyone had their identity stolen or any of their employees, they could probably sue Sony and maybe win. I mean, there was a case. And so FireEye came in and basically issued a report saying this is a hack that is unprecedented in nature. The sophistication of these hackers is so that no one could conceivably have protected themselves or could have taken any measures to protect themselves from a hack of this nature. I mean, it was so sophisticated that it didn't matter. So Sony was not to blame for being hacked. It had no culpability. And so it was criticized. I mean, there were even some articles criticizing FireEye for doing that because FireEye was essentially playing the role of a legal defense attorney in a way, right? Basically protecting their client from potential legal repercussions, right? Being that like kind of firewall between the client. And so when I read the fact that the DNC didn't allow the FBI even access to the servers, but called in this private security company, CrowdStrike. I mean, I thought right away back to that, and I thought, okay, well, this is interesting, because the only reason you do that, right, is to protect yourself from whatever, I mean, once you give the FBI access to your email, I mean, to your server. I mean, like the DNC was involved in some shady things, and that could open up a real. I mean, that could lead to some serious actual legal problems for the DNC, and so I bet that so the CrowdStrike is not even it's not a partial or an objective party in this. It signed a contract with the DNC to investigate, the cyber intrusion, a hack. But it's bound by a non-disclosure agreement, and it's working on behalf of its client, and so it protects its client, and I mean, there's a lot of and so we cannot take the word of CrowdStrike as without at least a little bit of skepticism, right? Because it is not even the FBI. I mean, the FBI we know is politically motivated. Everyone has, has some kind of motive, and at least, but we can at least understand it to some degree. CrowdStrike has a very clear motive here and a clear conflict of interest, and that we need to be able to factor that into their claims, into their evidence that they put forward. We cannot take them as just an objective observer in this, And so, yeah, I mean, they're these cybersecurity firms. They're interesting. They're kind of they're basically, yeah. I mean, I see them as like half public relations companies, half sort of legal, like a kind of a new type of attorney that protects the client in the case of a cyber attack, and basically safeguards their cyber assets, and yeah.
Whatever they are, they're not just these impartial analysts who are trying to get to the naked truth. They, just like an attorney is representing a client, that attorney has a duty to represent that client's interests. And the way that the media kind of portrayed CrowdStrike, you would have no sense that they were kind of fulfilling a similar role.
Yeah, there's another interesting thing here too, because Google actually invested $100 million in CrowdStrike about a year before the election. And I mean, John Podesta's email was hacked. I mean, it was hosted on Google, right? I mean, and essentially, what it highlighted, right, was how easy it is to hack someone's Gmail account. I mean, all you really have to do is to just create a sort of a believable looking login page, right, with a Google logo and a box that pretty much looks like a Google login box, and send them an email and tell them to sort of reset their password, or whatever, and you're in completely,
yeah,
right. And so like, it doesn't take a sophisticated attacker to do that.
No.
at all. In fact, it's more of social engineering. It's more of being clever, right? And so in a way, when CrowdStrike sort of blames the hack of John Podesta's Gmail account on an incredibly sophisticated Russian military intelligence operation, in a way, it also covers Google's ass, right? And it draws people's attention away from Google's part in all of this, because everyone uses Google pretty much, and a lot of people, hundreds of millions of people trust it with the data, but it's not as safe as you think it is, and it's like, and so Google doesn't want you to think about that. So everyone benefits here, The DNC benefits by having kind of attention away from its failures. It's not only its failures to secure its server, but its political failures. Google benefits because it draws attention away from the security flaws of its supposedly super secure cloud, right? And Google and CrowdStrike works for both of those plans. I mean, it's part owned by Google and it works for the DNC. I mean, it is a.
Yeah, Trump was mocked during one of the debates when he said that the Podesta hack, or I don't know what hack he was referring to specifically, but when he said that these hacks could have theoretically been done by a 300-pound guy sitting on his bed somewhere in New Jersey, who knows who actually did it. I mean, maybe that was sort of a crude way to put it, but it is sort of true that when we're talking about a hack that it's so trivial as to phishing somebody's Gmail account,
yeah.
I mean, the idea that this should be perceived as this grand interference scheme by an elaborate foreign kind of conspiracy, that's just sort of silly. But I mean, the extent that that incident has been blown up is just sort of amazing. And, I'm thinking back now to the time when CrowdStrike was reportedly retained. Hillary Clinton was still under FBI investigation for her own separate email server case. So There was even more of a political imperative on the part of Democrats to not start another email-related investigation, just because in the public mind that would be seen to reflect on Hillary, would only kind of amplify her political problems.
That is exactly right. I mean, that's good. That's a very good point. I mean, it would be seized, whatever was contained there would be seized as ineptitude, at least, right? And an inability to secure, sensitive information. How could she secure, Americans? How can she ensure American security if she can't even secure her own email server, right? And totally. And so, CrowdStrike could be brought in on the sly and sort of talk, and they could do an investigation and be like, well, actually, the Russians did it, It was so sophisticated, the most sophisticated operation. There's no way you could defend yourself against that. There's no conceivable steps anyone could take to defend themselves against a hack of this nature, because it's the FSB and the GRU working together, right? And so totally, I mean, so in a way, it almost replicates what FireEye did for Sony after its hacks, It really does, and back then it was criticized for basically selling indulgences. I'm trying to remember. I just remembered some security researchers actually criticized FireEye for basically coming out and bullshitting and saying that this hack, couldn't have been prevented even by the most sophisticated cybersecurity. And essentially what CrowdStrike came in here to do is the same thing, is a kind of an indulgence. Right, to a kind of, it's like we absolve you of your cyber sins. You're good. It's the Russians, and here it's the North Koreans. So it's and in that case, in the Sony hack, actually the North Korean servers that were supposedly used to hack Sony had been hacked not only by the Americans but also by the South Koreans. So they've been penetrated doubly, maybe triply. So for an attack to originate from a North Korean server that had been compromised by multiple other intelligence agencies, is dubious, to attribute it with certainty. And the same thing is happening here. The director, James Clapper, he testified in January, and they did this report on, they provided all this sort of technical evidence to back up their claims that Russia did it, and they supplied all these sort of IP addresses right? That were supposed to be used to launch these attacks. And sort of like there were these command and control servers used these IP addresses and to coordinate their attacks on the DNC and John Podesta. When you actually look at those addresses, I mean, they like maybe 20% or something come from the Tor network, and so like they could be anybody, they could be anybody, and they could be, the Tor network is also funded completely by the U.S. government. I don't know. I mean, the U.S. government, I know, the NSA funds Tor nodes. The GCHQ funds Tor nodes, as we found out from Snowden's documents. So the whole thing is it's very murky, and you could pick and choose any kind of piece of evidence to support any kind of conclusion, and it's really dangerous. And so, for cybersecurity, and if we're gonna make claims, and we're gonna accuse Russia or any other country of hacking American elections and throwing an election in favor of some candidate. I mean, this is a really serious allegation. I mean, it basically undermines the entire democratic system, right, on which America is built. I mean, this is an extraordinary accusation, and that requires extraordinary openness of evidence, right, and a kind of a public airing of everything, of all the evidence that our law enforcement agencies and intelligence agencies have, and it needs to be public, right? It needs to be discussed in an open manner, with the people of America, with Americans. You can't it can't be decided by a couple of private cybersecurity firms, right? And it can't
they've essentially privatized the evidence, right? Because it's not even clear that CrowdStrike turned over the forensic evidence to the FBI. So if they're in sole possession of it, it's not available to be examined in an open forum.
Clapper said that he cannot provide more evidence because it'll endanger lives, And the thing is, it's like, well, you know what? If it endangers lives, well, then it's got to endanger lives, because and lives are endangered every day, right? And they're taken every day. Now, but the claim here is that another country interfered in the electoral process of America and basically changed the course of an election to benefit its own interests, right? It elected, so the sitting president is an illegitimate president, right? It's basically a coup, a kind of a soft coup, right? Is what they're saying Russia pulled off.
Yeah.
And if a soft coup is not enough of a reason to endanger some lives, because you might have some sources in Russian intelligence somewhere or wherever that are well placed and are feeding you information, and that if you expose the information, they'll probably be killed or whatever, right? I mean,
what would be the grounds for doing that?
There are no grounds. That means that you can never endanger lives. I mean, only, I guess, maybe if there's an alien attack on Earth, and we are all at risk of being polarized by some kind of alien weapon. Maybe then we can sort of disclose our sources. I mean, it's insane. I mean, so this makes me think that it's all bullshit. I mean, I started out actually giving these claims the benefit of the doubt, 6 months ago, when some of the stuff started surfacing, and with every day that passes, I mean, I believe it less and less and less, to the point where I don't believe it happened at all. I don't believe, because there has not been a shred of evidence that I have seen that shows Russia interfered and hacked anything. In fact, all the evidence that has been shown has been it's not hard evidence. It only convinces people who want to be convinced and aren't really reading deeply into the actual evidence, and aren't looking closely at what is actually being offered to support these claims. And
so you're at a point now where you view the entire narrative as bullshit, or you don't believe the prevailing theory. But we have in the U.S. politicians just by rote now seem to just state as if it's an uncontested truth that Russia hacked the DNC. I mean, it's being presented as if there is no longer any doubt, and to harbor doubt is discrediting.
Well, yeah, to harbor doubt is to be a useful idiot, is to be right, to be essentially an unwitting Kremlin dupe and an agent, right? I mean, this is what one of the a security researcher who's from King's College, this guy named Thomas Rid, who is a prominent security expert, and he was he went at the last week at the hearing, or was it on Monday? I guess, right? It was on Monday the hearing.
It was last
week. It was Friday. Was it Friday?
It was last, I think, Thursday.
Thursday. All right. He went on and he said that journalists, had been, the Kremlin with its disinformation campaign and had hacked the emails, released them, to WikiLeaks, and of course this was reported by journalists, and that these journalists, by reporting on this, had become unwitting tools of the Kremlin.
Unwitting agents was the term he used.
Yes, unwitting agents. And and of course this is a guy that if you look at the resume of any cybersecurity expert, it's a resume that will be filled with work for military contractors at least, and usually probably a stint at some intelligence agency. And so Thomas Rid, worked for RAND, was a longtime RAND corporation analyst. The guy literally worked for the U.S. Air Force, for a privatized think tank, U.S. Air Force think tank. Now so he's not an unwitting agent, he's just a witting agent of the U.S. national security state, is what we have there. And so so you have a witting agent of the U.S. national security state calling journalists to report on leaked emails, showing, for instance, that the DNC planned to smear Bernie Sanders by using his Jewish faith to smear him and to kind of undermine his credibility with Christian voters in America, Christian Democratic voters in America. I mean, reporting on that is essentially becoming an unwitting agent of the Kremlin, says a witting agent of the U.S. national security state. It's totally insane. And so this is what we have now. And if this is the kind of evidence that is presented in a congressional investigation, basically attacks and on journalists who just are doing their job and aren't just swallowing the narrative and that the Democratic Party wants them to swallow and then to regurgitate, then these journalists are essentially engaging in treason. Maybe they don't realize it, but they're treason. They're engaged in treasonous acts.
Yeah, people like to talk about chilling effects or stifling effects, but now that theory has been propounded in the corridors of power in the U.S. Senate, maybe some journalists and others are going to think twice before they share a WikiLeaks email or do something that can be in any remote sense construed as somehow benefiting the interests of the Russian state, because in that case they can consider themselves unwitting Russian agents, and I don't know, maybe they'll suffer professionally because of that or socially.
Oh my God, yeah. I mean, I agree. I mean, I think that it's for any young journalist who wants to make a career in this dying industry. This is very constraining. I mean, the chilling effect is very real. I mean, I sense it. I sense when I want to publicly share an opinion about this. I mean, I feel it. And I mean, I don't necessarily let it stop me, but I feel I always wonder, like, okay, am I phrasing this correctly? If I'm tweeting something out or posting something on Facebook, am I phrasing this correctly? Will it give people ammunition to just call me a Kremlin agent or a Kremlin troll or just a Kremlin propagandist? And I do think about it, because I think, okay, well, because there's so much heat on people who question the narrative, that you really do have to be very careful about the way that you state and that you phrase and that you express yourself. And I mean, and I'm basically I'm like untouchable already. I'm never going to get a job in working for a major publication or a newspaper anyway, so I don't have much to lose. I've sort of have a little bit of a corner here in independent journalism and freelancing, but for anyone who actually wants to make a career at it at a mainstream publication, of course it's chilling. You have to fall in line or you can forget about it.
Yeah, I mean, basically every day now I'm accused in one form or another, sometimes from people with influential public platforms, of being some kind of stooge of the Kremlin. And, there are people who'd have fewer resources than I do and no institutional support who you could very easily see saying, hey, this isn't worth it. I have to worry about my own sustenance financially. And the idea that now I have to go around countering these accusations might not be in my best professional interest. Therefore, I'm not even going to bother broaching these issues.
Yeah, and then of course, if you're just starting out in this industry, and everyone around you, all your mentors and all your colleagues believe that Russia did it, and why wouldn't you believe it too? It's like it's one of those things. It's like, well, if everyone believes it, there must be some truth to it, right? Why? How could everybody believe it and it not be true? And how could all my people who I respect, and my boss and my friends in the industry and my colleagues that I read, if they all are convinced and they have much more experience than I or whatever, they're older. Of course, there must be some truth to it, and so it would be easy to fall in the line. There wouldn't necessarily even be much of a struggle. The question is, why do? And then you take a self-interested things like, why would I, waste and disadvantage myself to defend Russia? And Russia's or Putin, and Putin is already an asshole. Fuck him. It's like, why should I step in for him, right? I'll just and anyway, he's not on my team. My team is here in America. I believe in America, and it really has poisoned debate. I mean, it's gotten to the point where there are these groups that come up, right, that are basically compiling blacklists of journalists who are Kremlin agents, and you have the Washington Post actually writing about this group's efforts in a way that doesn't criticize the fact that some murky group is actually compiling a blacklist of journalists, and some of my colleagues are on there. I'm sure some of your colleagues are on there. The Naked Capitalism is on there. Truth Out is on there. Truth Dig is on there. Consortium News is on there. I mean, a lot of the outlets that I read and respect are on there, just because they are critical of the Cold War, xenophobic sort of madness that's happening right now in America. And so I mean,
Susan Collins is a senator from Maine. During that Senate hearing last week, she's a Republican, and she made a point to say that, and she extracted this from the witnesses who were testifying, Ridd and Watts and others. They sort of established that it's supposedly now in Russia's interest to cultivate these fringe ideological movements on both sides of the spectrum. So now, bizarrely, they're sort of associated with these right-wing movements, whether it's Trump or Le Pen. But what Susan Collins wanted to establish was that they're also kind of nurturing left-wing movements. So what this atmosphere is doing is it's sort of shrinking the confines of what's considered acceptable political expression.
Yeah,
and it's impacting both right and left.
I'm just glad that Marco Rubio is still in that sweet zone,
Yeah.
And Marco Rubio is like he's in there. He's not an extremist, I'm glad. I'm glad that he's still kept his sanity.
Right.
Yeah. No, I mean, look, I mean, it's pretty funny, like to think that basically Russia is to blame for Occupy Wall Street. It's to blame for the anti-fracking movement in America. It's to blame for European fascism. As if like Europe, as if fascism never existed in Europe before Russia came along. It's totally alien to that country, completely alien, to the Netherlands or to Germany or to France. I mean, fascism's never been there, never had even a day there, and so Le Pen is only really because of Putin supporting it. It's insane, or that there are right-wing movements in America that never really existed until Putin came along. Yeah, it's.
And that's actually what Hillary Clinton almost said explicitly during the campaign. At one point, remember, she gave this great speech on the alt-right that was supposed to be one of her finest moments.
Oh, yeah.
And she actually said that Putin was, quote, the grand godfather of the global alt-right, whatever the hell that means. But she was trying to frame it in terms of this ideological struggle in sort of this weird inverted version of what the Cold War struggle was. Now it's Russia that's promulgating this right wing and I guess splinter left wing ideology. It doesn't make any coherent sense, but that's what they were trying to push.
It's like, because you know what it is? It's because she was basically trying to poach moderate Republicans from Trump, right? Is what she was trying to do. And so she was saying, like, okay, there's this band of sanity, that exists among us. And we are the true Americans, we are, and you can truly support me. And everything else is basically controlled by Russia. And those people are for Trump, both the left and the right? And so you can't vote for them, and you can't support them. And so, yeah, it's that's what it is. I mean, it was a strategy to poach centrist Republicans, I guess, moderate Republicans, I guess, right? From this thing, it's totally insane. I mean, I can't even, I mean, I having covered the Koch brothers and like the sort of the Koch lobbying networks, and I mean, to me, it's just so, and the history of right wing politics in America, and the storied kind of, the really complex history and the grassroots nature of these movements, they spring from an American soil, and to have her just sort of discount that, and to have as some kind of Russian plot by a president that's sort of only been in power, for a couple of decades, and then by a country that's really weak and barely keeping together. It's basically come out of an almost a major war with no bombs dropped, right? I mean, it's the country's come out of one of the most traumatizing experiences of in its history, and to think that this country is sort of like created all these complex movements and has so much power that it can sort of have these things rise up out of the ground to threaten American stability. I mean, it's so cynical and so disgusting and so manipulative. I mean, we can laugh at it, I guess, but it is just depressing, and to have people believe it. That's probably the most depressing thing about what's happening in America.
Yeah, that's the thing. People are believing it. I mean, if you talk to your average rank and file Democrat now, as I have, going to these town hall meetings and different places, I mean, it's becoming just accepted wisdom that this narrative that's been woven is true. And that's, to me, among the most depressing aspects of this is, the people who are generally well-intentioned, but who aren't sophisticated news consumers and who rely on people in positions of influence to kind of synthesize information for them have now kind of been swindled. And
yes, exactly.
And who knows for how long they're going to, cling to these really, really misbegotten beliefs.
I mean, what's going to happen is this will create fertile soil, right, to launch future campaigns against Russia. It can be used to justify not like just a war with Russia, but a war, let's say, to support Ukraine, a war to support the perceived threat to the Baltic countries, Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, a war to support one of the dozens of former Soviet republics that sort of encircle Russia, right? I mean, and republics that are unstable and that are kind of part of the bigger chessboard that America has been using to kind of to destabilize Russia and to kind of keep it off balance, right? And so this I agree with you. I mean, I think this demonization will have the impact will be felt for a long time to come, and it will be used to gather support for something horrible in the future. I mean, we can be sure of that, and I mean that's the kind of the scariest thing about it.
People kind of chastise me on the internet for dwelling too much on this subject, but what you just outlined there is the reason why I find it almost difficult right now to focus on much else, because I mean the consequences of this in the short and longer term are just incredibly dire, and it only seems to be getting increasingly more panicked and crazy.
Yeah, or I mean, even Syria or Iran, I mean, they're going to be sucked into this, right? Because these countries have Russia as a kind of the really only sort of sponsor state, as a supportive kind of empire, and these are in the crosshairs of American empire have been for a long time, and so the demonization of Russia and Russians and their sort of their demonic kind of influence on the world and this supposedly corroding kind of influence on the world. I mean, they will be used to push for intervention in those countries, to do something there in the future. I mean, you can guarantee it almost. Yeah, it's really dangerous, and it goes way beyond Trump. And even if he doesn't win re-election or gets impeached by the time 4 years are up. This campaign is not going to stop, because I really do think that the establishment has found its kind of stride again, and found its it was really shaken by Bernie, I think, and by Trump, Trump's victory. But I think it's really this Cold War has really kind of gotten this blood going, right? And it really feels almost confident and sure of itself, and sure that it's right, and it's convinced itself that it's right. These people have convinced themselves that they're right. And everything kind of has fallen into place. It feels like to me, at least psychologically. I haven't been there. I've been away from America ever since right before the election, so I haven't seen it. But from talking to my colleagues and friends and family there, and reading the news and watching what's going on there, I mean, it really feels like I don't know. The establishment has really kind of gotten bold again. I don't know if you feel that. If that's the right assessment.
I think so, man, because I think the perception is that what they've done has been politically effective in that, like I mentioned before, it seems to have weakened Trump somewhat, maybe hobbled his governing agenda, and every week there are 2 or 3 stories that make a huge splash, which seem to add another dot to the web of connections that implicates Trump in some kind of Russian subversion scheme. So there's this sense now that their narrative is being increasingly vindicated, even though people with a little more adroitness, are increasingly skeptical. So I think, they're emboldened by what is seen as the success of what they've done.
Yeah, exactly. So it's worked, and so you can use it again and again and again and keep doing it. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's yeah.
All right. Well, I think we can leave it there. I think this conversation was pretty illuminating. So, Yasha, thank you for taking some time to talk to us.
Thanks for having me on.
All right.
Enjoy your day.